Everybody, thank you for coming today. We're super excited about our colloquium speaker today. We brought in an excellent speaker for everybody. So Brad Hardy is here from Georgetown University. He's with the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown. He has a lot of affiliations with various poverty centers. So if you're interested in research on poverty and inequality, Bradley is your expert. He's with Wisconsin, Columbia University, he has Kentucky, Washington University. Actually, one of our former PhD students co-authors a little bit with Bradley. So that's kind of cool. And his research, like I mentioned, is really looking at issues of inequality and economic instability, racial inequality, all sorts of really important and pressing topics. He's an outstanding researcher, and we're excited to have him. So,
Great. No, thank you, Stephanie. And I'm happy to be able to visit with you all, Glenn. And so the work today is with a fantastic research team out of the University of Kentucky, where I finished my PhD in economics. Kim Ziliak, along with grad students, Elizabeth Krause, and undergrad student, Shreya Hava. Just a fantastic group. And the project is really going to take you through, almost 50 years of inequality trends, making black-white comparisons, but also importantly, rural-urban comparisons over time. And we're going to really try to think hard about the role of the social safety net and potentially improving upon these sorts of inequality trends. And we'll see where we've landed over the course of the past 50 years. It worked. It did work. I might have to look at that and kind of waste back. Yeah. The worst case scenario, I can air out.
It's not good there, huh?
Oh, let me get it quick. There we go. There we go.
Oh, all right.
Okay, so thank you to the NSF. They've supported the work. It's part of a broader cross-national series of inequality studies. And so clearly, our sort of policy conclusions and interpretations of the results are really our own. Okay, so going to talk about motivation, and it's a cross-disciplinary room, and so for some folks, the topic doesn't need motivation, but at the same time, it's just worthwhile kind of making the point that look, racial inequality and specifically black-white inequality really has been among the most durable outcome gaps or differences in the U.S. since the U.S. has been a country, right? And so you can think about the whole source of descriptive or demographic factors that you might think drive these sorts of inequities on the dimension of income, of which earnings is a big part, but not the sole part. And that can get you down a road of thinking harder about a whole bunch of structural factors, exclusion from a whole range of markets. We're a market economy, social, political exclusion, even racial violence, and how those historical factors drive the outcomes we see. And again, 50 years, depending on how you look at it, I look at that as being relatively contemporary, right? But how's that drive what we're seeing in this evidence today? So that's in the background. We're not interrogating those sorts of forces, but certainly you want to think about the long line of work that's trying to think hard about, why we see what we see. Now, there's a whole long line of rural sociology, less so on the economic side, but folks have been thinking hard about rural economic conditions. I would say less studied from the economics profession, but thinking hard about the rural-urban divide here in the United States. And so you do see pretty sizable gaps in earnings, education attainment, more of a descriptive reliance on certain parts of our social insurance system, disability payments, for example. And it's interesting because around the time that you had major presidential commissions, like the Kerner Commission, focusing on aspects of racial inequality in the late 60s, you also had presidential commissions focused quite a bit on rural economic conditions, roughly around the same time period. And so, part of the point is to say that, these issues have been around in the U.S. context for quite some time. These aren't necessarily new questions. And certainly I think in the social sciences and policy community, The 2016 election really did cause sort of a rehashing or reconsideration of the conditions facing rural Americans, and particularly politics of resentment. So again, just these are some of the conversations that we had as a research team that motivated us to think about this question. I would say, as an aside, in the broader OECD project where you had just inside of 20 countries thinking about inequality, what stood out was that, you know, many nations don't actually collect data on race and ethnicity. And they have their reasons for doing so. And what this led to was that in our broader comparative study, we were unable to do any sort of stratifications or cuts by race or ethnicity. And so we thought that for the US case, it would still make sense to kind of take an off ramp to look at that sort of question. But, you know, France, for example, they don't collect any of this sort of demographic data, right? So that was kind of the motivation for how we landed here. The models and the methods that you're going to see will move pretty quickly for an hour, but we're basing this on some really fascinating work by Pat Baer and Kerwin Charles in a 2018 paper where they were really focused on estimating these black-white earnings inequality trends for about 60 years. Now, their approach, which we're essentially mimicking, was to think about inequality along two dimensions. To what degree do you close what you could think of as levels gaps between Black households and white households, Black individuals, white individuals? But then secondarily, how do you think about inequality along the dimension of rank? So you could imagine pretty quickly that you could close a gap and still maintain ranks as they were, right, over time. And so the question is, how does inequality look along these two types of dimensions? So relative positionality as well as earnings level gaps. And, you know, we're not going to necessarily take a stand on which is the right way. We think that both of these measures are going to tell you like two different aspects of sort of the broad question, right? But our main point is that, look, Bayer and Charles were rightly concerned about earnings inequality, and frankly, the modal way, the focal way that folks are lifting themselves out of poverty and into upward economic mobility in the US has been earnings. But we have a pretty substantial tax and transfer system that provides for a lot of benefits. Oh, by the way, should say, you don't have to interrupt me. Like if you want to ask questions, feel free to throughout. So that's up to you. So, you know, like we want to take account of the US social safety net system, much of which operates through the tax system. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but we have a whole host of refundable tax credits, namely the earned income tax credit, and, you know, to a lesser degree, the child tax credit, 2021 notwithstanding, where there was a big expansion, where look, the tax system's doing quite a bit as well. And much of my discussion is going to be focused on like the bottom half of that overall income distribution. But there's like some interesting stuff happening at the top of it that I'm going to try to kind of like briefly mention to you all throughout, right? The point here is just to motivate for us that we're bringing on a wide range of transfer programs that redistribute resources to households with lower income, and that we're also bringing online a whole series of refundable tax credits that are doing the same thing, right? Through a whole patchwork of policy expansions that really, they predate the 70s, but for our purpose, we're just trying to say, hey, look, there's a lot happening here. We have welfare reform occurring throughout the mid-90s. That does represent sort of a retrenchment in cash welfare resources, but then we're doing a lot almost concurrently through the tax system, EITC expansions, CARES Act, and you know, ARP more recently. You know, quite a bit going on to think about. Okay, so the first set of results that we're gonna talk about will really display what we'll refer to as levels gaps. So we're gonna place black and white households and then rural and urban households along some continuum, along a sort of a group-specific distribution. And then in the case of the levels gap, we're gonna say, well, for example, how would black incomes compare to white incomes at any given point of their own respective income distribution? So we'll look at that in percent terms. But then interestingly, we'll turn attention to thinking about this in terms of positionality or rank. So again, if we have a black household at the 10th percentile of their group specific distribution, where would they lie in the white household income distribution? Divide the 10. It could be relatively close. And then that could change over time. And so you can think of this notion that like, well, we're redistributing incomes and it's not explicitly race-based or geographic-based. I mean, you do have regional economic interventions like the Tennessee Valley Authority. You have economic regional-based interventions for the Black Belt. But in general, we don't think about a lot in the way of rural-specific transfer programs. That's not really how these programs operate. But our system could and does distribute benefits differentially across these groups. So we can learn something about what's happening here. Okay. So the main point that I want to kind of motivate here is that you're going to be seeing essentially the coefficients from a series of dummy variable regressions, okay? And we're going to try to transform this into a percent gap so it's easier to read out in the figures that we're going to show for the purposes of these percent level gaps, okay? And so we're going to do this first for black-white comparisons, and then we'll move on to rural urban. The paper is one that I'm happy to send you if you're interested, because we also show some interesting interactions. So we'll go black rural, black urban, white rural, white urban as well. I don't think I'm going to have time to show you that here, but we do have that for folks who are interested. The rank inequality gap is going to, again, construct this sort of group-specific distributional rank from the 1st to 99th percentile. And then again, importantly, we're assigning where in the distribution each Black and other race individuals' disposable income would lie, okay? And so, you know, I'll read it out to you. We'll sort of pick on the bottom end of the household income distribution. Though again, I'm going to try to say something about the broad trends that we see at the top end as well. I think it's probably a relatively neglected space that some folks are now working as well. We're working with very rich but imperfect census data from the current population survey. We'll talk about some of the challenges in the survey and what we try to do about those challenges, and really restricting this to 25 to 60-year-olds. And so you're going to wind up looking from left to right, where you're going to see kind of the most comprehensive definition of resources. So it's earnings plus what we think of as a really comprehensive version of taxes and transfer programs. And then moving along to the right, we're going to kind of take out some of the in-kind programs like supplemental nutrition assistance. And then finally, on the right-hand side, it will just be earnings. So I'm kind of trying to tell you what you're going to see before you see it. We try to adjust for household size. So that procedure is referred to as equalization. But the notion is that you want essentially in the denominator to try to take account for the fact that different size households require different resources. And so there's a whole set of literature on the right way to do that, and we try to do it. And then we certainly try to adjust for cost of living and prices using the PC. All right. So we have concerns. I highly recommend using survey data, whether it's the current population survey or the panel study of income dynamics. Nevertheless, the surveys do have their challenges. And one of the challenges in the CPS is that we've had rising so-called non-response in the surveys over time. So, any one of us in this room could be called by census enumerators for the CPS. It's computer assisted. You could participate in the survey, but like, there's nothing making you participate. And so you could elect to participate in the survey, and then you could selectively decide that you don't want to answer maybe one or two particular questions. They can make you do it. You could fail to respond to sort of a larger entire supplement. And so you've had economists and statisticians and sociologists to think really hard about how to adjust for and correct what has been rising non-response. And so again, there's sort of an important sub-literature that gets into this. The short version is that we drop these non-response observations and we reweight our sample to sort of adjust for this non-response. And so we think we can hopefully minimize some of the issues from the earnings non-response, but it's an issue in the data. But I'd also say that when you're thinking about issues of inequality, there's going to be a different set of issues that you'll bring to bear when you have industry data, admin data. That can include whether and to what degree you even know demographics, whether and to what degree you think that data is at all nationally representative. So ultimately, what I do believe is that we as a research community will try to triangulate around the answer in terms of what's happening with issues of inequality in the US. Top coding. Top coding is an issue. We essentially have, I see it. So top coding is an issue in the ASEC. And, the idea here is you are a billionaire in, was this Franklin County?
Yeah.
You're a billionaire in Franklin County who's 30 years old, that has 2 kids, and like, maybe this is not a great example, but suppose it's a smaller area. And we want to be careful about being able to totally identify you. And so, we top code the data. So maybe then the top code rises over time. Well, the census introduced a technique that would try to maintain our ability to say something about inequality while also retaining the confidentiality of these really high earners. And so this rank proximity swapping method essentially does allow for sort of a mixing up of the earnings data at the very top end. But it's actually useful for rank inequality work. And so we can backcast that method. Long?
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah,
Go back
no,
one
that's good.
slide, please.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
I was just curious, because you said you have estimated the probability of not being imputed based on all of these observed characteristics. I'm just curious what you learned. Who were the type of respondents who were more likely to not respond?
I mean, broadly speaking, we see some evidence of higher non-response at the left tail of the distribution. So yeah, lower moderate income respondents. If I'm overgeneralizing here, there's some evidence that there's a higher likelihood of non-response there. And then, again, there's a whole host of issues, right? Like we also think that we probably undercount resources at the very top end as well, right? So that's not necessarily a non-response issue, but we think there's measurement issues at the top end also. So, yeah. So again, we're trying to make those corrections, trying to reweight based on what we know there. Yeah. Okay, so we talked about red proximity swap. And then I'll show you an interesting trend here on non-participation in work across groups. And, like, the reality of the matter is that you might think that there are good reasons to think about the question of the role of non-participation in work. If you're out of work for any number of reasons, that this could drive the inequality work results in really important ways. And like, my view is that I don't think it means it's wrong to include or exclude that aspect of the problem, but you want to understand whether or not selection in work is sort of an important issue here across rural, urban, and across black-white comparisons. And so in the CPS, we do see this evidence of like meaningful gaps in the share or proportion of households that report zero labor market earnings. And again, these are 25 to 60-year-olds, right? And you might have some older students in this bunch, but keep in mind, it is the household, not the individual level. And so there's a race component here, there's a geographic component as well. I don't want to move on too fast here.
Are these age adjusted or is this just raw?
Yeah, so just raw, so the pooling the 25 to 60 units, yeah. And again, I should say, like, the CPS, you can think of this as kind of classic intra-generational mobility, repeated cross-section data from the 70s on. So again, the concern is that perhaps what we're seeing in our inequality results is simply rising non-participation in work. The rate of increase of non-participation in work is highest for white individuals and white households. So the rate of increase is higher for that group, though the level is lower. And you've had folks like Ann Case and Angus Deaton, among others, to write in depth about this growing challenge throughout the US. And so what we try to do is test the sensitivity of this by adopting what's called a median selection rule. And essentially the idea is that you're going to ask yourself the question, where in the distribution do you think these folks would lie with respect to earnings if they actually did work? And so now I got a box. And am I worried about this box?
No,
Okay.
you're all good.
Okay, all right, because I don't have that here. Okay. Where would they lie in the distribution if they work? And so the assumption of median selection is that they'd be in the bottom half. And so essentially what you're doing is that you're initially including them in the sample and then dropping them ultimately when you do your quantile estimation. And so we're going to do some comparisons. I'll tell you right now that, look, certainly non-participation in work is further exacerbating the inequality we see across rural, urban, and across black, white. And we were able to learn that from looking at median selection as a robustness check. And again, like, so, if you're in this literature, you probably anticipate some of these questions, but, this is kind of an interesting way of introducing some of these concepts. That there's also a sub-literature that's very much concerned about the possibility that our surveys are underreporting transfer income, and that maybe economic conditions at the bottom end of the economic distribution aren't as bad as they look in the survey data as a result. And so here, the thought exercise, though, is that for our purposes, you might need to actually see differential reporting of program receipt across groups and across regions for our comparative purposes. And we just don't know, I don't know much about evidence on this to date. I suspect folks are maybe working on this at places like Census, but I just don't know about that. That sort of evidence. Now, this is a pretty expansive definition of households receiving essentially sort of qualitatively anything. And you can think about this as receiving any of the social insurance programs, your standard means tested programs, food assistance, cash welfare, but even like $1 of a child tax credit or $1 of a refundable earned income tax credit, which is really actually outside the strict poverty universe, right? And so what you see is that, you know, based on the survey data, I would argue there are qualitatively large shares of households rising by rural status and by Black household status that receive at least something. Okay, so that's just sort of an interesting, you know, stylized fact that's revealed in the data. But again, like trying to make the point that in a different space, like this figure could potentially lead to an interesting sub-conversation in and of itself. Here, one of the things that we want to point out is that when I'm showing you results that also include cash payments from the refundable earned income tax credit, that is essentially the largest cash transfer to households with low income in the US over the past, you know, almost 20, 30 years, right? Again, let's leave out 2021. Well, we're running our current population survey through a tax simulation that's assuming 100% take up in the program. But one of the points that's made by Maggie Jones and Jim Zilli, the co-author, is that in fact, with 100% take up assumption, at first blush, none of us should like that. But you got to keep in mind also that there are improper payments that occur, and you know, maybe folks who are receiving the credit who we don't think should be receiving the credit, and we don't take account of that either. And so there is some offsetting, given that we can't account for that group. On the issue of underreporting cash welfare or TANF income, the admin data and shows, and I've worked with some of this data, shows that look, there really was a dramatic reduction in cash assistance post welfare reform in 1996, particularly so in the mainly the southern states with a higher proportion of Black residents. That's its own interesting literature on lower cash assistance in states with a higher proportion of Black families on the case. Unemployment insurance, you might be concerned about underreporting of that. But I think, again, there's reasons why maybe we aren't as worried as we initially were going. Okay, done with concerns. So if we focus first on the levels, again, we're going to work from the most expansive definition of income on the left to simply earnings on the far right. And so one of the interesting things we're going to find is that, look, you know, if we're thinking about Black households at the 10th percentile of their group distribution, then they go from being roughly 40% lower than white comparison households to 30% lower by the end of the sample period. And this is me kind of looking at the red trend on this far left panel, that this is an improvement in Black-white inequality, taking into account the whole set of tax and transfer programs. You can think about refundable tax credits, food assistance programs, things like this. So that's evidence of progress at the very bottom end of the income distribution between Black and white households. Mainly what the paper is about, the bottom end, but I would say, like my colleague at Georgetown Law, Dorothy Brown, my colleague at Brookings, Bill Gale, they focused a lot on this group at the top end of the income distribution. And actually what you see here is a relative worsening of Black-white inequality over the same time period. We don't have a technical definition for middle class in this country, but they are very much interested in how the tax system might be exacerbating inequality across race at the top end of the income distribution. They've got a whole host of papers thinking about this topic. Some of this is driven by how different types of income are treated within the tax system. So you can think pretty quickly about the notion that if more of your income is tied up in labor earnings, it's subject to a higher marginal tax rate versus income that might be from market income, for example, things like this. So not what the paper's about, but nevertheless, those results are there. And moving from left to right, in some respects, the broad takeaway is that descriptively, the tax and transfer system seems to matter quite a bit descriptively in reducing inequality. So again, Bear and Charles were really focused more so on this far right panel, earnings. But if we take into account these tax and transfer systems, we do see some level gap improvement, okay? Okay. Like to start with figures first.
This is not my area, so forgive me if this is a silly question, but like I'm thinking mortgage tax write-offs, like where does that figure in thinking about?
I mean, I think, and again, like my work has focused on the bottom half of the distribution where I think it could matter. I think it could matter, say, at the 25th, right? Because these groups, their dollar levels at the 25th percentile are actually noticeably different. You're going to see levels of home ownership, even at the 10th percentile of the white distribution that you wouldn't see, for example, at the 10th percentile of the black distribution. I actually think that it would matter quite a bit above the median, right? That's my speculation. But it is speculation.
So I guess maybe to add on to that, so the decision not to count something like a mortgage tax write-off in your work, was it because you were focusing specifically on, like, you know, there's a suite of programs that you're looking at.
Yeah.
Just wondering if that was something that you talked about.
You know, we should, I guess, so I will go back and double check, but we are probably approximating this, running this through the NBER's tax sim program. And so we do have a bunch of different inputs that the CPS can run through. And so we have, we do, I think, have estimates for mortgage interest deduction. And we also have rent interest and dividend income that shows up in here as well. Probably measured imperfectly, but we think we can capture that. I think we're capturing.
Yeah, I didn't know if it was
Yeah.
a data question or a conceptual question
Yeah.
as to how that's true, because I'm not familiar with the data set.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so, you know, I think we're capturing it. And, you know, the thing I have to think harder about is whether and to what degree that's gonna drive a bunch at the bottom end. My prior is that that's gonna be the kind of thing that's really interesting at and above the median, but I think there's probably reasons to believe we see these levels of home ownership far higher, even down the white income distribution, where you're not seeing that for their black counterpart households. Okay, so I think in some respects, we're showing that our system of redistribution is doing, to some degree and extent, what we would expect it to do when you isolate on this sort of broad, comprehensive definition of income. But if you then want to ask about positionality between black and white households, we don't see evidence of improvement for most of the distribution. And so, for example, if I'm going to pick on the bottom 10th percentile, black households at the 10th percentile of their distribution are persistently at about the 2nd percentile of the white distribution over a 50-year period. And that position is pretty much fixed and not sensitive to our definition of income. Okay. That's also the case at the 10th percentile. You do see some relative improvement for Black households at the middle of the Black specific distribution. That they're moving from just over the 20th percentile of white distribution to nearly the 30th percentile of the white distribution. Again, I'm focused on the far left panel. And so again, it's, the paper and the exercise is really trying to capture these differences in conclusions with respect to how we're thinking about inequality and potentially saying something about why we're finding what we're finding here, okay? Now, you're gonna see evidence of a slightly different story. The race geography interactions here for the most part, but they do exist for those who are interested. The gaps are wider initially between rural and urban households at the low end of the income distribution. But by the end of the period, the largest gaps are for relatively economically advantaged households between rural and urban settings. And being informed by some really fantastic scholars like Dan Lichter have some ideas about what's happening here. But again, you can see that there is sort of a closure in the gap when we account for different forms of non-labor income. And if you're paying attention again to that 10th percentile, see how, you get this real big jump over the 50-year period where there's this closing of the gap between relatively low income rural households and their urban counterparts. I want to say it now because I might forget later. We think part of what's happening is that the rural definition actually changes over time. So one of the consequences of an area improving is that oftentimes it's no longer defined as rural. And so there could be a mechanical aspect to this where you're a particularly successful household and you reside in an area that was rural and you have neighbors who were there and you're doing well and the area grows. And then if you were to look at the USDA rural urban continuum, at some point, you're now considered sort of a suburb of maybe a larger metro area. And so you could sort of have this result where kind of the households that are incumbent or remaining begin to look worse relative to their urban counterparts. So that's one potential component of what we're seeing here. We do see evidence. Absolutely, yes.
So just to clarify then on that,
Yeah.
did you dichotomize it or did you use the scale?
Well, we can do, this is my knowledge of this, for the so-called RUCA codes, rural urban continuum. We can get very fine gradations along this continuum of rural to urban. In the CPS, the best we can do is sort of metro, not metro. So in this analysis, it's not going to be as finely graded, but I still think that that's abstract. I think this is happening in the background. But we can't get that fine, a continuum gradation.
So you don't have the geocoded version.
Geocoded, but certainly not down to that small of a unit of observation. And I think some of this is about identifying survey respondents. But again, off ramp, you can actually get these rural urban continuum codes down to the track. So you should be able to follow a track over time and see how that census tract actually evolves and changes. But I think again, I think this could be an aspect of, not necessarily the aspect, but an aspect of what we're seeing. Okay. We do see more evidence of some improvement in the relative standing of these low-income rural residents, along the rank distribution. And again, this is sort of consistent. You saw the dramatic, evidence in these, percent level gaps, right? So like, for example, again, picking on the very bottom of the distribution, these rural households at the 10th percentile of their rural household income distribution essentially close the gap with their urban counterparts over the 50-year period. Like that's actually pretty good deal, right? So that actually does occur. They reach the 10th percentile of their urban counterparts by the end of the century, right? Relative to the 1970s. And we see similar trends and evidence for the 25th percentile. And again, I'm focused on that left panel that's inclusive of the tax and transfer programs, but you see a similar trend moving along to the right. And again, the opposite is true with respect to rank mobility for these relatively advantaged economic households. So you see more concordance between the level and the rank mobility evidence here. Okay. So the last 50 years have actually generally been a period of income growth across geography and race. So our assessment is that you see overall improvement in absolute terms, but there's different start points and there's different rates of improvement, right? So if we just take a look at log incomes across race, you see evidence of growth, right? Disposable income growth. So it's not that we don't have at the mean some sort of overall improvement, but there is something to be said for differences in the rate of change and differences in the essentially the points at which we begin. And we begin our snapshot in the early to mid 70s. So again, just trying to kind of unpack what we think is happening here in the background. That again, in this sort of kind of statistical horse race, if you will, that across race and across geography, look, there's again evidence of income growth occurring, but in log points, different start points, different rates of change over time as well. And it's just something to keep in mind in terms of why you might be able to see improvement in terms of a level gap, and then in the case of race, really not much of anything on the rank. So yes, that.
I know 2020 is your final point there. Does that include all the transfers from COVID period in 2020?
Yeah, so
Unemployment,
yeah, so we have exactly. So we have a lot of that happening at the end of the sample
so that's
period.
the uptick
Yeah.
from 15 to 20,
Mhm.
and slope up is.
Yep. And we, it's interesting we got some feedback that well, to be clear, let me step back here. We have survey year 2021 and we stop at calendar year 2020. But one of the keys, so we're trying to see if we can maybe keep out some of that 2021 stuff, right? But we did get the feedback that in order to clean some of this stuff up, it'd be better to show these 5-year gaps. I have some results for folks who might be interested, where I could show you this on an annual basis. But and actually this is an interesting aside. I think there's been a decision for a lot of quantitative social scientists to essentially maybe stop your analysis around 2019 or 2020. Because we think that it was just a strange period for transfers. And I've got some work with Charles O'Cam where we actually really lean in pretty hard on 2021 and it does look different, but I think it's still important to kind of double click on it. Yeah, so I think there's probably an argument to be made for carrying this out and looking at what happens. So let's see here. A couple more things that I want to talk about with you all. Relatively less time here, but I do just want to make the point that when we adopt a median selection rule, which is essentially making an assumption that folks who would report negative incomes or zero incomes, the non-workers would likely be in the bottom half of the distribution. Placing them there and then essentially dropping the bottom half and re-estimating these inequality trends, what we effectively find is that, look, the inclusion of these folks who are non-workers absolutely results in, anywhere from 5 to 10 percentage point worsen group inequality, right? So this group matters. Non-work is a component of driving the overall inequality trends. Is that something we're able to show here? So that's one interesting kind of policy piece. The other interesting measurement and policy piece to think about is how we think about the treatment of race and ethnicity. And so, I want to make sure I'm able to get to this. Long tradition in the US are thinking about black-white differences. But we do have in that binary regression, we do have Hispanic respondents as among the comparison categories. So technically they are in the analysis. They're in the regression where you're seeing some of the parameter coefficients that I'm plotting. But we can then more explicitly bring them back into the main results. And, I think this is sort of an obvious point. And I think there's folks in the room who would be really helpful to jump in on this. That, look, we're capturing different constructs when we think about race and ethnicity, and oftentimes in economics, we talk about race and ethnicity as if they're like the same thing. And so the empirical exercise that we engage in is, look, the standard comparison has been to think about non-Hispanic white vis-a-vis non-Hispanic. But when we ask questions, people are going to tell you about how they think about their race and their ethnicity. So some people will then say that they don't affiliate with a particular race. Other people will say they do affiliate with a particular race. And when we allow for that flexibility in the survey, we see evidence, and Pew and other folks have documented this, that if you were to just do a head count of more Hispanic respondents in the survey affiliate with white race. If you were to look at poverty rates, household income, statistics, things like this, Hispanic respondents on average are going to lie somewhere between the position of Black and white individuals and households. And so essentially what this does then is it kind of mechanically narrows the gap between Black and white workers across Hispanic ethnicity. So it's sort of statistically bringing some of the income levels for white respondents low. Now, I think it's also kind of worth pointing out, and I was just at a measurement conference a week and a half ago with a bunch of census economists thinking about this issue. The actual measure of what we refer to as Hispanic is a relatively new concept. This was adopted in 1977. And it is inclusive of a very broad range of residents and citizens in the US. And so it actually does not include Brazilians, it includes Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Mexicans, right? And not necessarily all hung together by necessarily a shared experience. And so this is the kind of measurement challenge that then raises a whole bunch of questions in terms of the notion that a follow-on project could very well think hard about thinking through inequality from the perspective of thinking about Hispanic groups. And it might also call for further disaggregating if you were going to be really thoughtful about what that sort of analysis would even mean. So, you know, we try to at least begin to acknowledge that the decision to think about level gaps and rank gaps from the perspective of thinking about non-Hispanic white vis-a-vis non-Hispanic black, probably then in and of itself is an omission and misses part of an important story. And so we show this sensitivity that in fact, there's more convergence when we're inclusive of respondents who are Hispanic. So it's a mixed picture that we see improvement on level gaps, particularly across race. We think that at the top end of the income distribution, along the lines of work from folks like Georgetown and Bill Gale, that tax policy might be exacerbating some inequality for higher income households. But at the bottom end of the distribution, there is some improvement. More convergence when we include Hispanic respondents. But importantly, there's no upward rank mobility for Black or rural households at the very bottom end over the past 5 decades, particularly so for Black households. So we don't see a realignment of relative economic position. I think both matter, right? The tax and transfer programs are improving incomes, but depending on how you think about income inequality, you may or may not see evidence of this. There's broader kind of economic contextual factors that we have to think about. Overall earnings inequality across race and place is just so dramatic in my reading of the evidence that like two things can be true all at once. The tax and transfer system is actually doing quite a bit, but in terms of rank inequality, it's not going to make a big difference, right? So just something to think about as we continue to make statements about what we think we know about inequality in the US. I think it just depends on how you ask the question. So appreciate you all letting me talk about this, okay?
Questions? I throw a question at you that I would like to throw up in the discussion question in my publication quality box.
Okay.
So given all of that, and so, you know, I guess one narrative is there's stubborn earnings inequality, say by race, and our transfer programs. I guess we work under a couple assumptions. Like one is that the take up is relatively equal across race, and we don't have differential programs by race, and so it's not going to overcome the earnings gap, right? I guess another narrative could be that take up is lower among Black people. I think there's some evidence of that in some places, maybe, but I doubt it would be enough to overtake it, even if take up was equal, fine. So I guess what is, it's a policy school, I guess. So what's the role of government, if there is one, in helping to solve this? Is it targeting the earnings gap? Is it like, you know, your read of the literature, your read of all this, you know, what would you say is an approach to targeting the inequality?
I think one conclusion that I have, and I'm thinking about this across the rural urban results and by race, is that like there are questions beyond the scope of my training around how individuals and households think about their economic well-being. And I do think that, you know, I heard it said that like people are basically little comparison machines. And so when they think about their status, you know, on some level, the issue around some dimension of household needs, food, clothing, shelter, utilities. And like, how are we doing? You know, you all probably heard of this ALICE index or indicator that talks about kind of living wages. How are we doing on that dimension? And so I think on some level, there's still a question around whether and to what degree the US social safety net is providing for those so-called needs, and that's of course that's like a philosophical question around what we think those needs are. Even including the timing of benefits. So like, one interesting thing about my results are that I'm able to look with my co-authors on an annual basis. But like economic insecurity is something that's experienced on a weekly basis, monthly basis. There are surveys that get at this better than the CPS. But like, how do you think we're doing if our strongest cash transfer program is delivered basically right now during the tax time? So, I think this work is actually informative for our political science conference. Because it says something about how folks across space and across race might think about their relevant position. And I'm not necessarily trained to think about what to do about that, but I do think that those results matter. And we should talk about this.
So over your time period, marriage and cohabitation patterns also changed a lot. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your decision to look at household, like you measured at the household level rather than the individual level, and then how that would differ or the.
Yeah. No, I mean, so part of Lauren's point is that over the same 50-year period, we see, and this is really interesting, I mean, across race, for example, overall, we see a secular decline in like marriage, for example. So in part, you can easily kind of make the mechanical point that you have a rising share of households across race and space that are working off of like one earner, for example. And I think on some level, it may actually just be sort of an interesting thing to look at these results on an individual basis. Some of this is trying to approximate a SNAP unit. So you have SNAP households. And so thinking that, you could have different family units within a household that are benefiting from certain transfers. And, getting into some of the details of the survey data, you can actually estimate CPS trends on an individual basis, a household basis, or a family basis. And you can have multiple family units within a household. So part of the idea is to try to see if we can get at some shared resources, but I actually don't have a strong feeling where I think you shouldn't look on an individual basis. So I think it's something that actually could be done, like that kind of extension. I think there's more to do on different groups. So serving a paper sheet.
I think in terms of different groups, one thing that comes to my mind is dividing the group by education groups, like in terms of the percentile.
Yeah.
And showing whether like how it maps to the percentile versus education groups, the inequality.
Yeah.
Especially at the top of level, I think you might, at income level, you might find interesting results.
Yeah, no, yeah.
I know this paper isn't about wealth, but I've seen like Pickett's work and others who have shown that the wealth inequality is like even bigger and growing. So, the source of income, when we get to the end, you've got all sorts of like transfer income in there. But if the income is transfer income, that's probably not contributing to or related to wealth. Whereas if the income is from like business assets and like real estate assets, then there's a ton of wealth in that.
Absolutely.
I've not seen anybody, I've seen the black-white wealth gap, and it's 10 times, it's huge. But I haven't seen a rural urban wealth gap. And I'm wondering, I'm sure somebody's done this, I just never seen it. And I'm wondering if the rural urban wealth gap is also bigger than the rural urban income gap. I don't know.
It's an interesting point. I mean, I heard it said recently that like, if you have a money manager who isn't working hard to make sure as little of your income
It's showing up in
is
this.
showing up in this,
Yeah.
then like you've got the wrong person. Then you want your income treated as like almost anything except
Yeah.
labor earnings. And like, I know of folks who are researchers who go out of their way to get their honorariums through like an LLC.
Mhm.
And I don't, have, right? But like, I'm told, like,
Yeah.
yeah, you'd be treated at a lower tax rate, right? So, like, absolutely, I think that there's an argument to be made, and this came up early on, that like, look, at the bottom end of the income distribution, we might worry about the measurement of the transfer system, whether or not we're capturing that accurately. But I think we also worry at the top end that we're undercounting the different sources of income and then overall wealth as a
Yeah.
result. So, I mean, you know, like, folks in this room are working on a lot of these things. You can try to get at this through, you know, the survey of consumer finances, panel study of income dynamics. I think SIP has some good network stuff, but I think it all kind of triangulates around your point, which is that we're probably underestimating these gaps at the very top end. But that's also like a whole argument. We could get into a whole picketing side of
Of course you can.
what are we doing with that?
All right, well, we're at time, so I want to make sure to let you go, but let's get our final round of applause.